game you're about to see, black is playing against the king's Indian setup, where white has the bishop fianchettoed, the knight on f3, the pawn on g3. A very solid setup. It's hard to break down sometimes, but what you're going to see in this game is how black effortlessly picks it apart, actually destroys white in less than 20 moves. So pay close attention. You're going to learn a lot about how to play against the Fianchetto setups in this video. Let's jump back to the beginning. This is episode 12 in a series where we're going through this book, Logical Chess, move by move. Let's go ahead and just jump right in. So the first game that we've seen now with the English, I believe, most of the games have been e4 and d4 openings. And the English is one of those openings that it's actually a very, very good opening. It's played a lot at the higher levels because grandmasters like to play c4, and then they have a lot of flexibility. They can transpose to a lot of different openings very easily. Okay, they can transpose to like some King's Indian attack setups. They can play d4 at some point and transpose to like a Queen's Gambit type of opening. There's lots of different things that they can do. And it's a good move. It still controls an important central square, and it lets out the queen along this diagonal, which is very useful. A lot of times the queen has some good things that it can do on these squares, and so c4 is a very solid move. Okay, but if you're a beginner, I think it's a little bit easier to start out with e4 and d4, but just know there's nothing wrong with c4 also, okay? So e5 is a good move, knight to c3. Both players are developing, fighting for control of the center, and this is very, very common in the English as well, because you don't move the e-pawn to let out the bishop here. A lot of times they'll fianchetto it along this diagonal, okay? And that's what we're seeing. So d5, black strikes at the center before the bishop is in place to really stop that, which is smart. And then right here, they simply retreat the knight. And I think this is a good solution. You have to be a little bit careful if you play a move like bishop to e6, because there's going to be this constant risk of queen b3. And if you're not paying attention, it can cause you problems, because all of a sudden there's a lot of pressure on these squares, right? And if you're not paying attention, you know, the bishop can come down here, you lose a rook, or you just lose a piece on d5. Now, it's a little bit tricky because white walks into the discovered attack, so they probably wouldn't do it right at this moment, but it's kind of constantly a risk. And so black says, let me just play knight to b6, remove all the tension from my knight so I can just focus on other things. And I think that's a smart kind of practical decision. Also, if the queen ever goes to b3, they've already blocked it off, so they're sort of planning ahead in that regard. Okay, so let's keep going here. Knight to f3 and knight to c6. Now, he makes an interesting point here, and he says, even though black only has 2 pieces developed and white has 3, black has great control over the board, and primarily it's because these bishops, even though they haven't been developed, they're controlling a lot of squares, right? And this is an important point. This is why moving the e and d pawns so early is such a great idea, because as soon as you move those pawns up, the bishops are immediately controlling a large section of the board, right? This also goes hand in hand with what we learned last time, knights before bishops, right? This is another reason why you have to move the knights out, because the knights sitting on their starting squares don't control a lot. Bishops, on the other hand, as long as the diagonal is open, they're immediately impacting the game. Okay, so you can kind of see the difference there. All right, let's keep going. So white castles, gets the king out of the center, which is smart. Bishop to e7. Black's going to do the same thing. d3, castles, and bishop to e3. So here's the position at the start of the video that I mentioned. White has the very solid King's Indian setup, and black has to figure out, okay, what are they going to do? And I like the approach that they chose. They play the move bishop to g4. Now, at first glance, you look at bishop g4 and you think, okay, what exactly are we threatening? Do we want to trade our bishop for the knight? And most of the time, the answer to that question is no. You don't want to just trade that bishop for that knight, because if you do that, you now have this very, very powerful bishop that you have to deal with, and you have no bishop of your own to counter it. Okay, that's usually not a good thing against the Fianchetto setups. We don't have a pin because the queen is not there because the pawn. So like, what's the point? The point is it's kind of like long-term pressure. Like if white in the future tries to move this and wants to push this pawn, they can't. Or if they want to move the queen away and they want to move the knight, they have to be careful. They might lose this. It's just kind of an annoying space. And what a lot of people do when they see something like this is what this person played in the game. h3. Like, get the bishop away. I don't want to deal with the bishop. Like, just play h3. And he mentions how when you play moves like h3, which are kind of just based on an instinct of like, it's just what I always do. rather than like, do I have a good reason based on this position to play that, you can get into trouble, right? You don't want to just play moves because, well, that's just what I always do. You should be looking at the board and thinking like, what makes sense in this position, right? So and of course, you've heard it many, many times in this series, right? Moving pawns in front of your king creates weaknesses. We're going to talk more about that in just a second. So black just retreats. And they say, okay, if you want to push again, you can. But now you've even weakened your king further, right, if white does this, okay? Because now the pawns are really pushed forward, and now the light squares get very, very weak, okay? So white decides, no, it's probably enough pawn moves in front of my king. Let me change strategies here and plays rook c1. Queen to d7, very nice move, connecting the rooks. And also, as you'll notice, is attacking on h3, which might not look like it's important now, but just keep an eye on that as the game goes on, okay? So here, white plays knight to a4. Now, the general rule is don't put knights on the edge of the board, okay? A knight on the rim is dim or grim, depending on how you've heard it. They just don't control as many squares. They can get stuck over there, and they're just not very effective. I don't know what white was thinking. I don't know if they were really wanting to trade here. I don't feel like that's really worth the time to trade that. It doesn't really seem to do much. If they're trying to go to c5, that's not a terrible idea. And temporarily, you can put a knight on the rim if you're jumping immediately back in. But I think for me personally, if I was going to do that, I would go to e4. Like, keep it centralized. I have more control over the board, and I'm still getting ready to jump to c5. So if that was the plan, I think knight to e4 would make more sense. But we get knight to a4. And let me see if this is the moment where I want to ask you guys the question. Yeah, this is a good moment. What do you think black played in this position? What do you think black played in this position? You got a chance to look at that. The move is bishop takes f3. And I was just talking a few moves ago about how like this really isn't the plan. This is usually not what black is trying to do. So why did they change their mind and take the knight now? Well, it's kind of based on a very simple thing. If the bishop takes, you jump in with the queen, you win a pawn, but you also now have your queen in front of the opponent's king, which just makes it nice to attack. But if they take the other way, the bishop now is kind of blocked off, which is nice, but also this guy is an isolated pawn. It's actually an isolated backward pawn, which is a super easy target. You can bring a rook over, you can pile up on that guy. It's going to be very difficult for white to hold on to that pawn. Okay, and so I think probably black's going to win a pawn very, very soon. So that was black's idea. So white decides, okay, I'm going to take with the bishop. I'm going to give up this h-pawn, but then I keep my pawn structure nice and pretty. And I have this powerful bishop, which should be a good enough defender for my king. And they weren't wrong, okay? Stockfish thinks the position is roughly equal, maybe even slightly better for white right at this moment in the game. So that was a correct assumption, I think, that white made, okay? So here we go. Queen takes h3. And he mentions how black's plan at this point was probably to just throw this f-pawn forward. And without calculating all of the details, they had this idea in the back of their mind. And I imagine that when black decided to capture here, they had this plan in their mind. This idea of like, okay, if the bishop takes and I take here, what am I going to do? Yeah, probably just throw my f-pawn forward. Maybe the rook can come up and over, or maybe I can just, I don't know, do something here. That's a very good idea. And a lot of times when you make these decisions, you want to have some sort of general plan in your mind, but you don't want to overthink it because you still don't know what's going to happen in the game. If you sit there and you try to calculate like every possible move, you're probably going to get surprised when white plays something you didn't expect. You're going to waste too much time. You're going to get into time trouble. And you don't always have to do that, especially when it's not tactical in nature. Okay, so a tactical position is when there's very clear threats of like, I'm going to go here, attack the king. King has to move because it's check. Then I'm going to go here, attack the queen. The queen has to move. Then I'm going to get a fork. Then like, it's very easy to calculate. This is more of just a general kind of thought. Like, I think probably going forward and I'm going to push this pawn, but kind of depends on what white's going to do, right? You have to react a little bit. So I hope that makes sense. All right, let's keep going. So white decides to trade here and grab their pawn back. Now, at this point, the material is even. However, when you are playing chess, this is critical. This is one of the most important things I'm going to say in this whole video. When you are playing chess, not only do you have material, which is like pieces, like knights, bishops, rooks, queens, pawns, you also have other stuff like king safety and active pieces and just different things that are going on that are worth something as well. It's not always just about the pieces. So white is caught up on the fact that, like, I'm down a pawn. Like, I lost a pawn. I got to get my pawn back. How do I get my pawn back? Oh, here we go. Here we go. I'll trade here. Got it. I got my pawn back. They think, cool, now it's an equal position. But actually, it was equal or even slightly better for them before this trade. But now that they made the trade, they got the pawn. Now I'm looking at the stockfish evaluation. Now it says black is better by a little bit, by about half a point worth. How did that happen? It's because their king all of a sudden got super weak. By giving up that bishop, that very, very good defensive piece for their king, they now have a terrible position. Not terrible, but it's starting to get terrible, right? You have to be really careful getting so caught up on those pawns that you make these weaknesses. Okay? Let's see how that plays out. So takes. And black has a nice move here. Knight to d5. Now, knight to d5 has two threats. If you would like to pause, what are the two major threats that this move has? Okay, if you had a chance to think about that, the first threat is obvious. You're going to take the bishop. Let's say white plays a random move. You're going to take the bishop. And when they recapture, now the pawn is undefended. You're going to take here, and that looks very, very bad for white, right? So that's the first obvious threat. But there's also a more subtle threat of jumping the knight back to f6 and then jumping it over to g4 and checkmating the king like this. Okay? So there's actually two very, very clever threats there. And so white has to figure out how do they want to deal with that. And so white decides to play queen to e1. Now, how does queen to e1 deal with those threats? Well, it deals with this one because they want to just recapture. Now their pawn is defended, and black, can't do that. And they're thinking that if black tries to do the other one, knight to f6 to g4, well, now they could play f3 because they've also defended the g pawn, and it keeps the knight from jumping in. Okay? So that's white's idea. However, black had other ideas in mind. What do you think black played next? Well, if you had a chance to think about that and you remember what we talked about earlier, black played the move f5, right? This was kind of one of their plans initially when they got to the queen to h3. And here they go. The pawn is marching forward. If it gets to f4, it's going to be attacking these guys. It's opening the way for the rook. And this is very, very scary for white. Okay, and you're going to see how powerful of an attacking method this is. When both sides are castled on the king side, a lot of times pushing the f pawn forward to open up the rook, get the rook involved, is one of the most powerful things that you can do to attack. Okay, so that's what black is trying to do here with f5. All right, so white says, okay, let me play bishop c5. First of all, white's position is already kind of falling apart. They try to play bishop c5. Now, before I say anything else, what do you think black played? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is f4. And this is critical. I think a lot of people would get distracted here. They would say, okay, what's white doing? What's white? Oh, he's attacking me here. And they would probably start to think about doing something. Or maybe you take this. Maybe you don't want to get distracted when you have a very, very powerful threat that your opponent has not really dealt with. Yes, this is attacking something, but it's defended. If we needed to recapture, we could. So it's not really a big threat. And they didn't really deal with the issue of like, hey, we could still play f4 and we could still start to open up the king. And black says, I don't really care. I'm going to continue with my plan. And they play f4. Okay, so don't get distracted when you have a solid threat, unless your opponent actually is doing something that's worth your time. Okay, that's what we see here. It's just not worth it. So f4. And I mean, you're going to take here, open up the rook, maybe even push forward in some cases to threaten checkmate here. Also clears this square so the rook can come up and over. So many different things that black is trying to do here. Okay, so white decides to play bishop takes e7. Now, a little question for you guys. If they did play the move g4 instead, so if they didn't take here, but they played g4, what's the quickest, easiest, and fastest way to finish off the game? By the way, we were outside the other day and I have like mosquito bites all over and I'm just like constantly scratching. So if you see me just keep doing this, I apologize. How does black finish off the game the quickest way possible? All right, if you had a chance to think about that, the move is f3. Now, you could also win the game by taking the pawn and then bringing the rook up and over. This would work. But white's going to be able to like throw in some random moves to just like delay the game. You take here with the bishop. You could block with the bishop. It just stalls the game a little bit. The fastest way possible after g4 is actually to move f3 because you're threatening checkmate. And if white takes you, you play knight to f4. again, threatening checkmate, and they actually have no moves on the board that can deal with this threat. Okay, so that's just it. All right, but that's not what was played. That was if they played g4. White decided to actually just take here. Okay, what do you think black played? If you had a chance to think about that, the move is f takes g3. Again, going back to the idea of like, if your threat is so powerful, you don't have to respond to what your opponent is doing unless they're actually making a legitimate threat. And black's like, I don't really care if you take this. I have checkmate. Like, you want to take my rook? Go ahead. That game's over. Thank you very much, right? So, and now, by the way, Stockfish actually likes the move capturing better. And the reason is because it attacks the rook and forces the rook off of this 6th rank so that the rook can invade and come over and checkmate the king. So there's nothing wrong with recapturing that. But I think it's nice how black just ignored it and just continued on with the attack because it was such a powerful attack. Okay? So when you get a queen in front of a king and there's no pawns to defend, you just need some more pieces over there. And there's like always checkmate threats, right? And that's what we're seeing in this game. Okay? So f takes g3. White recaptures. What did black play next? You got a chance to look at that. The move is knight to e3. And the threat is queen to g2. Black doesn't really care about the rook here so much. They're really just focusing on checkmate on g2. Okay? And white doesn't have any good ways to stop it. Yeah, you can make this trade with a check. Doesn't really do anything. Black just recaptures. You still have the threat. You can't use the queen to help because the rook's there. And black's going to win. And then if they play the move rook to f2, if you want to pause, what's the finishing touch here? That's correct. Queen takes g3 check. You can't block because it's checkmate, so you have to move. And then the rook comes down. There's checkmate here. Only thing you can do is sack your queen to survive a few more moves, but there's another checkmate, and it's all over. Okay? So just like that. It's like move 20, 22, depending on which line white chose, and the game is over. So how did this happen for white? Where exactly did they go wrong? I mean, they had such a solid position. Right? You go back to here. White's position was so solid. And look what happened. Bishop to g4. They didn't like that, so they played h3. A small weakening move, but a weakening move, right? And now this h3 pawn is a target, right? And so black has the option to do this, and the queen has invaded. Okay, that's only step 1. Step 2, where white went wrong, was giving up the bishop. If you don't trade that, you just play a move like bishop g2, kick the queen away. It's an equal position. The game's going to go on. I don't know who's going to win, but there's no attack now that black has. It's going to be very good because this bishop is a great defender for the king. So that was a really big mistake that white made. Valuing that pawn and being afraid to be down a pawn. It's just a pawn, right? It's still early. It's just a pawn. And that was a huge mistake. And then black did a great job of centralizing the knight, creating these annoying threats, and then activating all the pieces, primarily with the f pawn. That's all it took. Just getting this rook involved and not wasting their time, you know, reacting to these other trades. They just pushed the pawn and won the game. Okay? That's it. Yeah, that's it. So let's go ahead and jump to questions from last time. So I have some over here. Let me see. Okay, yeah. So from last week, we have this game. And one of the questions from ZZ Afad 8507 said, basically, the principle that we talked about last week, one of the principles was only move 2 pawns early in the game. Don't move more than 2 pawns early in the game. And then the opening that we're looking at, black plays 3 pawn moves. So what's the deal? Remember, they're just principles. They're just guidelines. They're just like, generally speaking, you do this, but there's always exceptions. And some of the principles are more firm than others. Okay, so like, don't bring out your queen super early, I would say is a pretty good one that you want to follow most of the time. Only move 2 pawns. Yes, that's a good one to follow like a lot of the times. But if you're playing an opening that's been played before by grandmasters, and you know that like, hey, these are good moves that have been played, there's nothing wrong with making 3 pawn moves. I mean, there are openings that are like that where you actually make 4 or 5 pawn moves, but they're openings that have been studied and played by grandmasters. If you know that, it's totally fine, right? It's when you're in those situations where like, I don't really know what to do. Okay, let me follow these principles, right? That's what they're there for. They're like guidelines. But if you have a specific reason and you know, like for a fact, or you can elaborate why it's good to break them, it's okay. And that's what's going on here. Black is saying, look, this is the setup that I'm going to go for. Knight on f6, e6, c5. And I know that this bishop needs to be over here to put pressure on the center this way. So b6 is a perfectly logical next move, right? And that's okay. And there's lots of other openings I could give you examples of this. So I hope that makes sense. It's a good question. But remember, principles are just guidelines that are true most of the time, but there's always going to be exceptions, okay? And one more thing. Pete mentioned that I wanted to talk about. So right at this moment in the game, okay, we talked about how black had the threat of knight to b4, forking these guys. It was a really annoying threat, so white played a3. Pete said white could play bishop to a3, deal with the threat, and also develop a piece. And I think he's absolutely right. Now, the only thing that I would say is you have to be a little bit careful, because notice that this bishop and this bishop are lined up. So that just means that there could be tactics for black at some point in the future with the capture here, right? Like, for example, if the queen moves here, which is a bad move, but like if the queen moved here, you'd have to watch out for this tactic, because now your queen's hit, but if you try to deal with that, then you're going to lose the bishop. So I will just say be careful when you move pieces that are lined up and undefended. That's kind of the two parts that scare me about this move. It's the fact that it's lined up with another piece and it's undefended. I'm a little bit afraid to play that move. But he's not wrong in that you do deal with the threat and you develop a piece. So it was probably better than what was played in the game a3. All right, so definitely see your point. And I just wanted to mention, just be careful with, the tactics that could pop up there. All right, guys, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time for game number 13, which is on page 75. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.